One of the most important discussions on literature comes from Aristotle, who wrote Poetics in the 4th century BC. Even though the work is incomplete, it remains fundamental in understanding literature. Aristotle defines literature by highlighting its unique qualities, explaining its function, assessing its value, and defending it against those who see it as useless or harmful. He argues that literature is different from factual writing because its main goal is to tell stories, whether they are purely invented or given new life through imagination. Another purpose of literature is to provide pleasure through creative use of language. This description does not serve as a final definition, but it helps explain how the term literature is being used in discussions. Interestingly, English does not have a single word that fully captures the meaning of the Greek word poiesis, which refer to imaginative writing. Rather than all written works in general, the word poetry once had a broader meaning, as seen in the writings of Sir Philip Sidney, but over time, it has become more specific. Similarly, the term literature has expanded too much, making it difficult to capture the precise meaning of creative writing. From ancient times, the use of language for anything other than factual truth has been viewed with suspicion. When moral and philosophical systems were developed, poetry was often questioned. In early civilizations, the difference between poetic and literal truth was not always clear, because language itself was deeply symbolic. People used metaphors naturally, and imagination played a big role in interpreting reality. The poet Percy Bysshe Shelley argued that in the early days of humanity, all language was essentially poetic, filled with fresh and powerful images. However, as language evolved, words lost their original vividness, and only new poets could restore the power of imaginative expression. When poetry became more self-aware as an art form, it also became more suspect. If poetry does not tell the literal truth, is it immoral, or at least useless? This question has troubled many thinkers. Strangely, early societies seemed to recognize that poetic imagination could reveal profound truths. As civilization advanced, however, this understanding faded, and critics had to actively defend the role of poetic imagination. In a self-conscious society, one of the most important tasks of literary critics became justifying the value of poetry, something that early humans had taken for granted. One way to defend poetry was to separate it completely from ordinary language. Some thinkers saw poets as special beings, not using words in a normal way, but speaking through divine inspiration. This view protected poets from judgment by placing them in a different category. It made them seem like prophets or madmen, sometimes one, sometimes the other, and sometimes both. This idea was not entirely new. Many ancient cultures believed that prophets entered a state of frenzy before delivering divine messages. Plato presents this idea in his dialogue Phaedrus, where he describes poetic inspiration as a kind of madness sent by the Muses. Those who try to create poetry without this divine madness, he argues, produce unworthy works. Plato expands on this idea in Ion, where Socrates describes poets as passive vessels, through whom divine inspiration flows. Using the metaphor of a magnet, Socrates explains that inspiration is passed from the muse to the poet, then to the performer, and finally to the audience. In this view, poets do not create through skill or knowledge, but are merely channels for divine expression. There is irony in the way Socrates discusses this, as he makes Ion, a professional rhapsodist, admit that he loses control of himself when he recites poetry. The dialogue suggests that poetry has an almost hypnotic effect, drawing in both the performer and the audience. Despite these ideas, Plato later criticizes poetry more harshly in the Republic. Since the book discusses how to create a just society, Plato is concerned with what kind of education should be provided to citizens. He argues that stories influence the minds of young people, shaping their moral character. Because of this, only morally uplifting stories should be allowed, while harmful or misleading tales should be censored. In his discussion, Plato makes an interesting distinction between useful lies and harmful ones. Some falsehoods, he argues, can be beneficial if they promote good values. However, stories about gods behaving badly, as seen in Homer's works, should be banned because they present negative role models. In Book X of the Republic, Plato gives his strongest critique of poetry. His main argument is based on his theory of knowledge. According to Plato, reality consists of perfect, unchanging forms, while the physical world is only an imperfect reflection of these forms. Since art and poetry imitate the physical world, they are imitations of imitations, making them even further removed from true reality. Because of this, poetry is not a reliable source of truth. Plato also argues that poetry appeals to the emotional part of the soul, rather than the rational part. Instead of encouraging reason and wisdom, poetry stirs up emotions, making people more impulsive and less disciplined. This is dangerous in a society that values self-control and rational thinking. He believes that indulging emotions without restraint weakens character and leads to poor judgment. Later philosophers, especially Aristotle, challenged this idea by arguing that poetry can have a positive effect by helping people process emotions in a healthy way. Plato's arguments against poetry have been repeated in various forms throughout history. His critique is still relevant today, as similar concerns are raised about literature, movies, and other forms of storytelling. His work forces us to think about the purpose of art and its impact on society. Even though he saw poetry as potentially harmful, he also recognized its power, which is why he took it so seriously. His arguments paved the way for later discussions about the role of art, truth, and morality. Aristotle later responded to Plato's critiques in Poetics, offering a defense of literature that has shaped how we understand storytelling even today. Instead of viewing poetry as an imitation of an imitation, Aristotle argued that it reveals deeper truths. By representing human experiences in a meaningful way, he also introduced the idea of catharsis, suggesting that literature helps people manage emotions rather than simply stirring them up. In many ways, Aristotle's response to Plato set the foundation for literary criticism as we know it.